Annie is the Chief Research Officer of Conversation Strategy. She has more than 15 years of experience as an online market researcher and specializes in data quality and social media research. Annie is a member of the CASRO, MRA, SMR social media research committees. She was previously the VP of Online Panel Analytics at Ipsos, as well as a research scientist at ICOM. She has presented at the ARF, CASRO, MRA, MRIA, NetGain, IIR. We've got a lot of acronyms here, Annie, and has also published numerous articles in both professional and refereed magazines and journals. Personally, I love Annie's tweets at LoveStats, and she maintains the LoveStats Marketing Research blog, which is one of my personal favorites, and I don't even love stats. Outside of her, seriously, I'm not kidding, outside of her work and online life, Annie occasionally showcases her attempts at being a better baker and gardener. And without further ado, I will kick off the last presentation of the Festival of NewMR.
All right, thanks so much, Susan. I'm just going to...
Do you have control?
All right. So my name is Annie Pettit, but you might know me as LoveStats on Twitter. I'm the Chief Research Officer of Conversation Strategies, which is a market research company that specializes in quantitative social media research by researchers for research. And I'm based in Toronto, Canada, and it's about supper time for me right now. So since the NewMR Virtual Festival has given us the opportunity to step a bit outside of the boundaries of a formal presentation, I'm going to take full advantage of it and go to the fun side today. So welcome to Mr. Survey Flirts with Ms. Social Media Research. I hope you enjoy it. Once upon a time, there was a man named Mr. Survey. He loved to help his clients write the most useful and engaging surveys possible. His clients loved how committed he was towards helping grow their business through quality research. But Mr. Survey was very sad. Over the years, he watched survey response rates decline. He remembered the good old days when response rates were 40%, 50%, and even 60%, and that was without incentives or any fancy footwork. Now it was all he could do to get response rates of 5% or 10%. The people who would normally answer his surveys kept telling him the same things. The surveys were too long. They didn't have the time to complete them. 60-minute surveys were too long to fit between dinner and putting the kids to bed. 30-minute surveys were too long to fit between finishing up with the dishes and taking the dog for a walk. His responders were also telling him that surveys simply weren't relevant. They didn't like answering long surveys about topics that weren't important to them or answering so many of the questions with a don't know or none of the above. In focus groups, they were no better. People were having a terrible time finding 3 or 4 hours to travel somewhere for a reward of cookies and cake. It was getting harder and harder to find fewer and fewer people who would help him with his research. But Mr. Survey knew those people were there, somewhere. He just had to find them. Now, Mr. Survey, as we can all tell, wasn't a bad guy. He had many great qualities. For instance, he knew exactly how to measure quantities and frequencies. He could set up surveys with questions like, in an average week, how many times do you walk your dog? And he would give people the option to choose from 0 or 1 or 10 or any other number. Mr. Survey could also ask, on average, how many minutes do you take your dog for a walk? And in this case, he would let people choose a number from 0 to infinity. Well, not infinity, but isn't that a great way to identify a survey responder who's zoned out? Another thing Mr. Survey was really great at was attribute batteries and personality tests. It was so easy for him to set up surveys with questions like, on a scale from absolutely describes to absolutely does not describe, would you say you are energetic? And he could continue this with many other types of questions, such as early product adoption, extroversion, creativity, generosity, patriotism, reliability, and so many other questions. Even with all these great characteristics, though, Mr. Survey had a problem. He had a great client who needed some research about athletic shoes, but in order to gather all of the information his client needed, Mr. Survey would have to write a 1-hour survey, and he knew he couldn't do that to his loyal and faithful survey responders. But Fortunately for Mr. Survey, he was kind of cute, and some cute girls had been paying attention to him all along. And that is when Ms. Social Media Research introduced herself. She had heard about some of the problems Mr. Survey was having, and she knew all the right things to tell him. Being a girl, of course, Ms. Social Media Research, or Ms. SMR, as her friends called her, could easily listen to millions of conversations at once. It was a highly desired skill, and this was the perfect place to showcase it. And even while listening to millions of conversations, she could keep track of every single conversation topic. Whether there were 10 or 30 or 3,000 conversation topics, she could keep tabs on every last one. Ms. SMR quickly realized that Mr. Survey was good with numbers, so Ms. SMR was quite pleased to also tell him that she could turn all of those conversations and topics into measurable data, just like what he would get with every survey he ever launched. So, to impress Mr. Survey, who was after all quite cute, she began her work. She knew that Mr. Survey was interested in conversations about athletic shoes, so she went online and started listening. She went to social networks like Facebook and LinkedIn. She visited blogs like Twitter and Blogspot and WordPress, and she checked out video sites like YouTube and photo sites like Flickr. She also visited commenting sites and question and answer sites and review and rating sites. She went everywhere and listened to everyone. She gathered up all of the information she had found and dropped it into a nice electronic database, just like what Mr. Survey was used to seeing all the time. And now, Ms. Social Media Research was ready to help Mr. Survey. So Mr. Survey had a big problem to start with. There we go. He knew which brand was his client's brand, and he knew which brand was his client's main competitor. But he wanted to make sure his survey was relevant to the survey takers by including a list of competitive brands that mattered to them. And he didn't know which brands those were. Fortunately, Ms. SMR was ready to help. She gathered up her millions of conversations and painstakingly searched through every single one looking for any mentions of athletic shoe brands. Since she wanted Mr. Survey to be impressed, she told him it was a lot of hard, dedicated work, and she'd eat an entire box of Nanaimo bars to keep up her strength. Maybe she should have told him that it had actually only taken a minute because she had some software do it for her, or maybe little white lies are part of the dating process. To impress Mr. Survey even more, she gathered up the brand names that she discovered and put them into a pretty word cloud. It would show the brand names depending on how often they occurred. So brand names that were hardly ever mentioned would be tiny, and brand names that were really popular would be big. Mr. Survey would like that. So she showed him the word cloud, and in just an instant, he could see that 5 major athletic shoe brands mattered to his consumers. Well, he thought, that was far easier than guessing and far quicker too. So Mr. Survey pulled out his survey draft and found the purchase intent question. And in that slot, he carefully wrote out just the 5 brands that mattered the most to his consumers. Fortunately, both his client's brand and the main competitor were in that list. What a great result. Now he wouldn't have to guess about what brands to put in the list. This would be essential to allow him to keep his survey as short as he possibly could. Mr. Survey had a similar problem with another question. He wanted to know where his consumers liked to shop. He also knew, though, that the options were limitless. How was he to choose from the thousands of available stores? Should he just include shoe stores? But wait, maybe his consumers didn't care whether they bought their shoes at a shoe store or somewhere else. Of course, Ms. MR was only delighted to help Mr. Survey again, and she performed her magical task once again. Using those millions of conversations, she went through all of them all over again. Naturally, she told Mr. Survey it took forever, but it was really no problem. She would do anything for him. So she gathered up all the mentions of retailers, whether they were shoe stores or department stores or anything else, and she made a pretty word cloud for Mr. Survey. He took one look at the list and was thrilled. This was going to be easy for him. In fact, he could pick out the shoe stores he wanted to add to his question, and he could even start to think about the psychographics of his consumers. Apparently, people interested in his clients' athletic shoes were also interested in other high-end brands like Prada, Gucci, and Chanel. His client would love to hear that their consumers weren't all that cheap. Mr. Survey was delighted that Ms. Social Media Research was able to shorten his brand listing and his retailer listing to the most essential brands. It would certainly save him the incentive costs of a long survey, as well as keeping his survey responders happy and engaged. The shorter the survey, the happier his responders would be. But Mr. Survey really did want to know about not just 5 brands, but 500 brands. He wanted to know about the high-end shoes, the low-end shoes, and all the boutique brands in between. He wanted to have a question on his survey that looked like this and went on for 10 more pages, but he just couldn't afford to do it. But wait, Ms. Social Media Research was ready to save the day again. She gave Mr. Survey a suggestion. "Oh, dearest sir," she said, "I have the solution for you. You go ahead and measure those 5 brands very precisely among your very specific group of people, and let me measure the rest of the brands my way. I will travel the social media space and gather all of the conversations about all of the other brands you're interested in. You won't have to make your survey any longer. It will still just be 15 minutes, but you'll have information about every last one of those 500 brands." Mr. Survey was astonished. "You can do that for me?" he said. "Well, certainly I can," she said. "In fact, I'll even set up all the information to look exactly like what you're used to seeing. I'll set it up so that you have a 5-point scale related to purchase and individual scores for every one of those 500 brands. Mr. Survey could not believe his good luck. This pretty little lady was certainly impressing him. Now, as cute as Mr. Survey is, he really wasn't all that interesting or creative. He'd already had trouble thinking of the brands that mattered to his consumers, and he could barely think of which stores would matter. How could he possibly imagine all of the other types of conversations that would take place related to his shoes? Well, you guessed it, Ms. Social Media Research, she was ready to solve the problem. And why, you ask? Well, as I said, Mr. Survey was kind of cute. So what did Ms. Social Media Research do? She knew that Mr. Survey needed information about shoes, and she decided to give him a major overload on shoe information. Not only would she listen to all the conversations about athletic shoes, she would see what other types of shoes people were talking about. And here's what she discovered. Out of all the types of shoes that she looked for, some were talked about a lot, while others were talked about not so much. For instance, in her group of people, basketball shoes generated about 800 conversations, golf shoes generated about 500 conversations, and running shoes generated about 7,000 conversations. Apparently, Mr. Survey's consumers were really interested in talking about these kinds of shoes. On the other hand, the consumers weren't terribly interested in certain types of shoes. Lacrosse shoes, platform shoes, and bowling shoes did not make the cut. No one was talking about these shoes. Well, that was good to know. Now Mr. Survey knew what types of shoes were and weren't generating conversations among his consumers. But that wasn't enough to keep him happy. He didn't want to know which types of shoes had lots of conversations. He wanted to know which types of shoes were generating positive or negative types of conversations. Fortunately, Ms. Social Media Research had thought ahead to this very moment. She was, after all, quite smitten with Mr. Survey and wanted to show off her skills as much as she could. She decided to put all of the conversations she had gathered through an automated sentiment engine. This engine would read every last one of the million conversations and decide how positive or negative the comment was. Comments like, "I love Adidas shoes," would be coded as very positive, while comments like, "I don't really like Adidas shoes," would be coded as somewhat negative. She knew that the automated engine wasn't perfect, but neither were human beings. And her engine could code 1,000,000 conversations in just minutes. That would certainly help out Mr. Survey, who was always running out of time. And she showed this to Mr. Survey. He was able to see out of the 800 conversations related to basketball shoes, about 3% of them were negative, or bottom $2, about 44% of them were neutral, and about 53% of them were positive, or top $2. What a great finding. And he could also see that out of the 1,200 conversations related to sandals, about 9% of them were negative, about 52% of them were neutral, and about 39% of them were positive. Mr. Survey could easily decide which types of shoes were most popular based on the number of conversations and the level of sentiment. Mr. Survey had already fallen in love at this point. He'd never met a lady who had so much to offer. But Miss Social Media Research, she wasn't done yet. She was ready to throw in that last unequivocal temptation. You see, Miss Social Media Research hadn't just looked at conversations related to shoes. She knew that people didn't talk like that. She knew people talked about finances, and politics, and vehicles, and music, and food, and shopping, and so much more. She knew that conversations about Adidas shoes sounded more like, "I wore my Adidas shoes to the political rally," or "I forgot my Adidas shoes at the park," or "I brought my Adidas shoes to McDonald's and forgot them there by mistake." You see, people don't just talk about Adidas shoes. They talk about Adidas shoes as part of their life. So what did Ms. Social Media Research do? She collected every conversation about athletic shoes. She collected conversations where people talked about shoes in restaurants, shoes in shopping, shoes in music, shoes in TV shows, and of course, shoes in food. Just like the good old days where Mr. Survey would get 300 pages of data tabs dropped onto his desk, Ms. Social Media Research did the same thing, but this time with social media research data. Mr. Survey could not believe his eyes when that big whack of paper dropped on his desk. He flipped through page after page after page after page and briefly settled on one. Food. Oh, how Mr. Survey loved food. Could it be an entire section on food within his athletic shoe survey, his research? Oh, it certainly was. Apparently, even when people are talking about athletic shoes, they still like to talk about food. And it seems that people talking about shoes also like talking about butter and cake and cheese and chili and chocolate. And this was just the first page. Mr. Survey could not hold it in any longer. This person, called Ms. Social Media Research, had so many wonderful characteristics that blended so perfectly with his. He had to act, and quickly, before anyone else did. Mr. Survey got down on one knee and proposed to Ms. Social Media Research. "My dear SMR," he said, "I want to make you the happiest research methodology on earth. I have much to offer you. I can give you quantities and frequencies. I can give you census rep and target rep numbers. I can give you answers to unique attribute batteries. You are my better half." And Miss Social Media Research could not believe her good luck. She certainly was not at a loss for words. "My dear Mr. Survey," she said, "I have so much to offer you too. I can give you sample sizes that you never dreamed of. I can give you flavor around your key measures. I can give you unending lists of relevant brands and stores and TV shows and politicians and celebrities and video games. I can give you strange new ideas that you would never have thought of before. You are my better half, and I will marry you." And with that, Mr. Survey and Ms. Social Media Research could not be kept apart. Arm in arm, they proceeded to conduct research together, each sharing their strengths and filling in the other weaknesses. And from that one fateful day, every day going forward, Mr. and Mrs. Social Media Research Survey lived happily ever after. Before I open the floor to questions, I want to give a resounding thank you to Ray Pointer for coming up with the great idea that is this virtual conference. I'd like to say thank you to Ray and the entire team for the hundreds of hours that they have put into making this such a great conference. I really, really hope we do this again next year. Do remember to visit the discussion site. I'm happy to chat about anything that I've mentioned here. And now I'll open the floor to questions.
Fantastic. Annie, thank you. That was, I found myself, I'm sure others were giggling at different points during your presentation, starting with the pretty word clouds and moving into my thinking about whether Ms. Social Media Research actually gave Mr. Survey a boyfriend makeover when they first got together. It was great. I do have a couple of more serious questions, though, for you. One is how social media research can work with focus groups. Since you were talking so heavily about with surveys, I know that you have a point of view on this.
Sure. One of the big advantages of social media research is basically it's gigantic numbers of topics. So we can use that portion of the research to bring in so many different topics and narrow it down to the few that really matter to you, and bring those topics into the focus group situation to really flush out all of those ideas on an individual basis. Because if you look back at social media research, for the most part, what it's doing is grabbing individual ideas from individual people. So it's one idea from that person, another idea from another person, but it's not an entire comprehensive set of ideas from individuals. And that's one of the main things that the focus group has to offer in this case. Mm-hmm. In addition, of course, there's so many other advantages of focus groups that we already know. In-hand testing, really watching how people are using things, doing things. The main features of focus groups that we all really love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can absolutely see how the narrowing of topics and actually identifying some of the topics when they're a bit unclear for clients would be a fantastic precursor to and help actually design your qualitative research.
Definitely, yeah.
One more. I'm looking for any other questions, but I have one more for you. And this should spark some debate online for us later. Is social media research eventually going to replace surveys? Is Ms. Social Media Research just going to knock off her husband?
How much is the insurance?
Yeah, I know.
Well, for me, this is an easy question. I hear it over and over and again, and I suspect this question raises a bit of fear from people, particularly people who are experts in the survey methodology. My response to that is social media research can absolutely never replace surveys. It can never replace focus groups. It has its own particular niche that's going to work for certain objectives, just as every other method has its own specific uses. Now, I do expect that there will be some decline in the need for surveys or the need for focus groups, but there will never be a decline in skilled researchers. So whatever skills have been applied to the survey methodology, sampling, weighting, scaling, norms, all of those basic essential requirements of the research process apply just as much to the social media research space. So whether your preferred methodology is surveys or focus groups, it still applies to all of the other methods, including social media research as well. So we may slightly shift where the focus of methodologies are, but the entire set of skills is going to remain completely unchanged.
Okay. Wow, Annie, fantastic. You have just absolutely ended our first ever, and I didn't say only, Festival of NewMR with an absolute bang. Thank you so much, Annie.